Well, hey Judith, thanks for coming along to a interview for the Brisbane Stoics. Would you like to introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. So my name's Judith Stove. I'm a Sydney-based author and researcher. I've been involved in Stoic circles in Australia for a couple of years now, and met Courtney through, I think it was Brisbane Stoics or Stoa Antipodia. And we've been involved in other book groups and discussion groups. My academic work has been mostly on Jane Austen and her period, but I also am very interested in all kinds of ancient philosophy and how it was interpreted and received in later ages. So yeah, it's great to be with you, Courtney.
Great. And I actually went back and listened to your Stoicon-x from, was it last year or the year before, about nature?
It was just last February, actually, yeah.
Oh, right. Okay, wow. Yeah, and I thought that was really interesting. And you have a special interest in nature, it seems.
Yeah, definitely. As you would have gathered from the talk, I really identify with, I guess, the Stoic idea of nature as a interconnected web with plants, animals, and ultimately humans, and even the mineral world, if you like, connected together in a network which we don't always understand the connections, but the more we learn, I think, the more we find out about the connections, the parallels, and the ways in which the system works together.
And I liked how you set up a kind of interlocking or interconnected themes around nature and Stoic ideas. So you had, I think you had, what did you have? You had virtue and reason and nature and fate and how they kind of work together in this kind of ordered whole. What interests you, I guess, about that kind of perspective?
I think it's a perspective that we maybe don't see as often these days. I think a lot of our ideas about nature, and I was just thinking about this morning, we did a reading recently about by Nietzsche, Ecce Homo, and we looked a little bit at the fact that earlier in his career, Nietzsche was quite drawn to Stoic ideas, but by the time he came to later in his career, he seems to have changed his view. And one of the things he seems to have been quite opposed to was the Stoic idea of nature as ordered, beautiful, harmonious. For Nietzsche, I think nature was pretty much red in tooth and claw, and that was, I guess, an idea that partly got some traction from the Darwinian revolution in the mid-19th century, the idea that creatures and species, or within species and more generally beyond species, that the organisms are in competition, and the idea of that competition became very prominent in culture, and I think possibly that may have influenced Nietzsche, and Nietzsche's own views, I think, had an outsized influence on what came afterwards. And so I think nowadays, to some extent, in popular culture, we don't really know what to think about nature. You know, we have these competing ideas. I was just looking this morning at the idea, it came up in another group I'm in, about nature as being hostile, a hostile environment which we are called upon to compete in and somehow conquer, which I think also ties in with some of the ideas of the scientific revolution that also maybe Nietzsche was thinking about. But that seems to be also a prominent idea in culture. So we seem to have lost, to some extent, we have lost the idea in culture of nature as a positive kind of environment. You know, it's and particularly, I suppose, the more we learn about disease, you know, viruses and bacteria, that side of nature can appear as particularly hostile. So I think that's an element of it as well. So yes, I think the Stoics want to bring, if we read the Stoics, they're bringing us back to a more positive view of how we fit in the world. But there are certainly a lot of influence in culture at the moment that would be in direct opposition to that idea.
Yeah. Just as you were talking, I was just thinking how the concept of nature and our relationship with it has changed so much over the course of 2,500 years or so. And I remember reading in Nussbaum's book, Therapy of Desire, she mentions early on that the ancient Greeks were particularly sort of struck by this kind of battle between techne and touche. So, on the one hand, misfortune or luck or the wheel of fate, and what we could do about it, whether we could kind of use philosophy to find a way that we weren't inevitably caught up in the machinations of fate and misfortune. And then, but that on the other hand wasn't necessarily connected to nature. That was our attitude towards nature kind of loomed large there. And then later with Augustine, I think you mentioned in your talk, our relationship to nature changes again, so that we've inherited an original flaw or a sin. And then, like you say, now we've returned in a sense to a much more antagonistic view of techne, where we think that we can dominate with our science, for example, we can dominate nature and kind of yoke her and get her under control. And that seems to be raising new and thornier issues all the time that people like Freud and the phenomenologists are kind of commenting on. Yeah, so it's a really interesting history, and I guess that moves us through into this kind of modern era. Like your area that you're quite interested in is how nature or virtue has been reformulated in is it the 19th century or the 18th century?
Yeah. So, sorry, and you did ask originally, Courtney. I omitted to mention it, but in that talk I did for Stoicon, I did focus up front on the way that the ancient Stoics, and it goes right back to Chrysippus, or what we have of him, really stressing the fact that for humans, part of acting according to nature is to be virtuous. Now that, again, that's completely counterintuitive to us, because we're so conditioned to think of humans as at least as bad as we are good, I suppose. And as you know, as you mentioned, there's been different currents with that. Part of it was the Christian inheritance from Augustine, that humans are fatally flawed by original sin. Now we don't necessarily accept that anymore, but it's taken different forms now. And so we have quite influential in culture is the idea, and it's had its it's had an expression in the works of Viktor Frankl and of Solzhenitsyn, that the line between good and evil runs through the human heart. And that's also a very popular idea nowadays. But again, if we come back to the ancient Stoics, their view was, well, no, on balance, and if we act according to our being as best designed by nature, then we are acting virtuously. They really made an equivalence there. It says in the Greek, is honesty. It means it is equivalent. Acting virtue is equivalent to living according to nature. Now, again, that's so counterintuitive to everything we have in our well, you would know in the psychological literature, that would be not something that would be widely accepted or even treated seriously as a concept in psychology these days. So did you want to maybe enlarge on that a bit?
Well, I think you always raise really interesting topics, and I think it just gets my head thinking about it. But yeah, that is really fascinating. And there's this idea, I guess, that in the ancient world that virtue is synonymous with happiness. But nowadays, and you mentioned to me the other day, we live in a post-virtuous world, and I thought that was a really interesting turn of phrase, because now when we talk about happiness, we don't really talk about virtue at all. Like, it's kind of doesn't enter into our thinking. We think instead of, I guess at the most base level, we think in terms of whether we can meet our basic material needs, pay the mortgage, for example, and then at the higher end, I think it's a really perplexing question. I don't think people know. Sometimes it's called the search for meaning in people like Viktor Frankl. And in the neuropsychologies, it's called having the right balance of serotonergic or dopaminergic activity in the brain. So yeah, but very little talk about virtue. But interestingly, I've read a few articles lately in the positive psych movement, which often gets kind of treated with a bit of contempt by serious psychologists, but it's still popular nonetheless in psychotherapy because of its strength-based kind of interest. And they're trying to reinvoke this idea of virtue towards happiness. But well, they try to do it in a way that sometimes comes across as a bit clunky because they try to quantify their procedures. So again, they like to do little experiments where they can measure whether virtuous people are more happy than supposedly unvirtuous people, which probably raises way too many complications. I mean, how do you measure something like that for a start? But did I go off track there?
No, that was, I'm so glad you raised that, Courtney, because just to go back a step, and if we are talking about virtue, and as we do live in a post-virtue culture, we live in a pretty narcissistic culture, really. And also, and the very term virtue is something that if you're in the gym or you're in the shops and you talk about virtue to people, you're going to get some pretty blank looks. It seems it's a technical term these days, and if you're not involved in the Stoic community or some other ancient philosophical tradition, then people aren't really going to know what you mean. So it's something I've been considering. And you just mentioned a moment ago when you mentioned the positive psychology, strengths-based approach. Well, it seems to me, and this is something I'm kind of exploring through my blog posts at the Walled Garden, maybe if we can think about virtue as strength, and that would work etymologically, because our word virtue comes straight from the Latin virtus, and that word cognates both with the Latin word vir, which means a man, and the Latin word vis, which means force or strength. It would also, I think, work in translating the Greek arete, which is often translated as, when it's not translated as virtue, is translated as excellence. And so that captures it. But I think strength captures something a little additional, which is both, well, it captures the cognitive side of things, which in the Socratic tradition, virtue is seen as cognitive, essentially, but it also captures an idea of skill, and it captures an idea of physical capability, which perhaps we've lost in our understanding, whatever the term virtue might mean. So this is just something I'm working through at the moment in my blog posts, and yeah, I haven't really seen people talking about translating the ancient words as strength, but maybe it's got some potential for making our ideas a little more comprehensible in our culture.
Yeah, and definitely in the case of the positive psychologists, I think, in fact, that's why they call it positive psychology, because it's a reaction against the pathologization that often, well, has historically happened in psychology. So we tended to notice what was deficit or faulty in the human psyche, and then work up our interventions around that. But the positive psychologists had this idea that instead of just focusing on what's wrong, maybe we should focus on what's right and what's adaptive and what's they got, like you say, those strengths and values and skills and capacities that people do well even when they're struggling, and then enhance those. And so through that, virtue has entered, and ideas like eudaimonia get thrown around too. They're they're much more modernized, but they do capture pardon me, part of the spirit of it, because now they're starting to be more flexible in their terminology and talk about flow and that easy experience of being in the world even when faced with difficulties. So there is a spirit of that ancient sense of eudaimonia coming in. I think it seems to be the case in these strength-based approaches. So that's hopeful.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So I suppose in terms, and if we start from something like that, another thing I'm interested in is how virtue or strength will look like in the world, and something that maybe a way we can look at it is the way that the characteristics or the strengths that we want our children to develop, for example. And I think that can be a useful way into the whole idea of what a desirable strengths for people to develop. You know, we would want to see our kids, if we have them, grow up as capable people, but as just people who will treat other people fairly, who will exhibit bravery when they need to, and who will have a good work ethic, which is part of self-control. So I think another way into this idea of virtue is through looking at what we think as pro-social and desirable features in the people that we're capable of influencing.
Yeah. And it's funny, like you use the term post-virtuous, and you're right. I think at least with a kind of majority, there are kind of the opposite of virtuous behaviors. What are they? Vice-ish behaviors that are often kind of applauded, you know, like this kind of sociopathic competitiveness, for example, that's popular in business culture. But then again, aren't all our movies and that about how the good always conquers bad? And deep in us, it seems there is a want to praise the virtuous person, and it's just somehow updating what it means to be virtuous and make it relevant. And like you say, maybe maybe the positive psychs and that sort of group are onto something, trying to find a way that it's articulatable in the sort of modern scientific language. Or
Yeah.
And how would you deliver that, do you think? I mean, is education an interest that you're in? Like, I mean, how would you give that to young people or parents?
Yeah, definitely. And it does come as a surprise to people to learn that we do have a values framework in Australian schools. I don't think it's been updated since 2009. And if you go back and look at it, it's pretty wishy-washy and confused, which is kind of, I think, a good illustration of how confused we are in culture about what we do value and what we want, what traits we want children to learn to develop. So, but yes, we do have a values framework, and maybe that would be, it would be great to have an update on that and to really understand what are the values that we think are going to be a benefit in society in general, for both individuals and young people in general. So yeah, I think it would be great. I know there are some people doing great work in the classical education space, but I'm not sure how much traction that's getting. It may be a bit further advanced in the USA. But I guess the other thing too is that's by its nature going to be a fairly niche kind of pursuit, right? So it's going to be outside both the public school system, it's going to be outside the independent school system. It's pretty limited at the moment. For something to really have an impact on culture, it's going to be a bit more widespread. I think maybe the ethics in schools, that I don't know what the situation is in Queensland, but we do have ethics in schools here in New South Wales. Again, it's not really universal, but certainly there are ways in, I guess, ways into culture, and maybe that's something that might be a bit further advanced down the line. But I think it's going to have to be, it's up against it in competition with reality television and with social media in terms of influencing younger people.
Yeah, that's right. There's these kind of sad and pernicious influences that kind of distract us from what modern Stoics at least think is worth being interested in. But no, I think that's really interesting, and the values, and you got me thinking too about. I was recently reading through the code of ethics for psychotherapeutic registration, and they have very kind of, you can read the code of ethics and basically you'll be struck by how it sounds like virtue ethics. There's words like non-maleficence and beneficence and things like that, that they take seriously and they expound on. And I assume it's the same in medicine, and probably because of the long roots to Hellenistic philosophy that's in the background there, right? You know, through Galen and people like that. And Hippocrates. So it still manages to be there. So, but also, I guess just as you were talking, I was thinking, there's often, the psychological disciplines are often maligned in some ways, in that they, well, in the critical school, for example, because they do kind of have a coercive or kind of controlling element on the way people, on the way society, you know, manages its status quo and all that sort of thing. But I was thinking, for good or for bad, it has allowed certain kind of mental health strategies to enter school spaces. You know, for example, my children are only little and they're already learning about mindfulness in school. So that's directly aimed at distress management and those sorts of things. But if virtue through things like Stoicism and prosoche, for example, as a practice of relaxation or attentiveness, can enter, as mindfulness has, into public discourse as a kind of technique, you know, then, you know, maybe down the track we'll have kind of mindfulness based activities that are also paired with, you know, thinking virtuously, kind of as a kind of a compatible kind of technique for stress reduction, for example. So as watered down as that sounds, that could be like a move in the right direction.
Absolutely. But I think one of the most pressing issues, I guess, where a virtues focus could really help, I think, is in anger management. You know, I remember years ago reading, when I was doing some research on virtue in the virtues tradition, in the New South Wales Crimes Act, there is something about somebody has so far lost self-control that they committed X, Y, and Z. And I thought, well, may, you know, quite possibly, when a lot of defendants are standing in the dock, that's probably the first time they've heard of the concept of self-control from the judge. and that seems to be, and we do have a problem with anger in culture. If you look at assault figures, some assault rates, I believe, are going down, which is great, but others are going up. We have a cultural problem with anger. You can see it in road rage. You know, it seems to me that there's a really serious problem there. And again, I think it's been exacerbated by social media, where people haven't learned to control their aggression, and we see it we see it on the roads, we see it on social media, and unfortunately, we see it in the court system. So I think that's somewhere where the ancient theories about the importance of controlling anger, we see it in Seneca and we see it in Plutarch. They both wrote De Ira about anger. And they do include some really basic techniques. So I remember one of the techniques in the ancient texts is, one of them is that very basic idea of taking a moment, you know, taking time to before reacting. So I think there's some real lessons that we can learn from the ancients in regard, particularly to anger.
And again, anger is one of those emotion that's sort of been valorized in our culture. Like, you can go down the pub, for example, on a weekend and watch two men bash each other half to death in the octagon, you know. And I don't know, I find that I'm not squeamish, but I just think, why am I watching this? But don't judge me. Other people might love that. But
But just on that, the ancients, of course, had the pancration, and they watched boxing as well. So I don't think there's necessarily a relationship. I mean, martial arts would tell you that the good martial artists aren't angry. So I'm not sure that martial arts is necessarily where we're seeing anger, because hopefully that will be disciplined and controlled aggression. I think it's where
I was thinking more like boxing seems like a bit more gentlemanly than the MMA, for example, that, they got blood dripping down their face and all that sort of stuff. And it seems that young men get quite aggressively passionate about those sort of sports and that, which is, maybe I'm getting detoured here, but I guess the point is, as a man, I guess there's this sense in which, especially as a young man, that you want to feel that you're capable of defending your own needs and the safety of your family, and a lot of young men would fantasize that they have the skills to do that and the ability to mobilize their aggression as required. So, we don't really talk about that sort of stuff very much either, So it's, yes, anger is there in the background, but so is this desire to be able to be maybe a nurturer or a defender or a protector or something like that. And how do you get to be that now in a culture that condemns, on the one hand, condemns violence, yet on the other hand, sort of parades it in other ways as entertainment? I see some tricky kind of considerations.
Yeah, well, as regards entertainment, again, going back to the ancients, look at the Roman arena. Now, the Roman philosophers realized that that this entertainment of watching humans kill each other and killing animals was, on objective levels, horrendous. However, it presumably served some kind of cathartic function, the way that violent movies presumably do now, if we think they serve any useful function at all. Maybe it's a way, and certainly I guess the Roman emperors regarded it as a way of, bread and circus as a way of focusing the public's attention on something else rather than political ideas. So I guess there is that cathartic aspect to it, or there may be.
Yeah, true. And my history is rusty, but I might have read somewhere that Marcus Aurelius at least kind of limited certain more violent aspects of the games, and I think he kind of ended the human, was it the slaves being chopped up?
It was don't think so, but I'd have to check.
Yeah, I think Commodus brought it back into popularity and even fought in the games. His son, but my history is not that great, so I'll have to go and check that later. So anyone watching this will probably have an opinion on that, will know more about it than me. But no, I think it's a really interesting subject, and we're kind of talking about issues that are sort of in the background for the Stoics, because we're talking about anger and sort of there are kind of this concern, but there's this side to it too, and sometimes it's justified and sometimes it's not. And that raises for me something I've been thinking a lot about, because you said, Stoicism might be useful for people with anger issues. But I also think for drug addiction too, because this toing and froing, this back and forth, there's sometimes this and sometimes not this, is this kind of ambivalence that's antithetical in Stoicism. And we often talk about this, at least this is my interpretation, as a kind of movement towards a more coherent, rational picture of the universe or the cosmos. And would you agree that when we're caught in the grip of emotion, or even with the addiction, for example, there's this ambivalence, like in one moment you take this position and in the next moment you take that position. So though in motivational interviewing, for example, they'll talk about in terms of sustained talk, like, oh, I got to keep using, or change talk, but I've got to stop using. And the person is constantly moving between various positions, which prevent them from getting out of the situation. And I assume a lot of, and we can all relate to this, that sometimes when something's gone wrong in life, like you're dealing with a grief or something, you oscillate between various opinions. It's very painful, and it's very confusing, and the Stoic idea to me seems to be that we somehow abandon an ambivalent picture of the world, and we have one kind of standard or one measure that we're able to invoke, and that shines a light to the way in which we should behave. Does that make sense?
Perfect sense, Courtney. In fact, this is something that Seneca says more than once when he's invoking the figure of the Stoic sage. Now, we know the idea of the sage brings a few issues with it, in terms of the sage really being the only person who's truly virtuous, and that kind of raises some issues. But the key feature of the sage, apart from being completely virtuous, is consistency, being constant, being uniform, not changing, not being subject to the vicissitudes of events or emotions. So I think you're totally correct in that idea that the Stoics emphasize the constancy of the sage, and that became a theme through history. And even to the point where Seneca says somewhere, it's even the wise person will even go for the kind of boring and predictable rather than the eventful and exciting, because the boring and predictable is more conducive to virtue than the varied and exciting.
Yeah.
And again, that's pretty countercultural for us, because excitement and experience is valorized and valued for its own sake, whereas the Stoics would say, well, not really. It's a bit more risky.
Yeah. And in conversation with people who either aren't interested in Stoicism or think that it's something that it's not, they will often say, sort of with a kind of great or grave kind of dissatisfaction, they'll say, how dare you trample on my emotions? They have a really important place in my life, and I would definitely choose the roller coaster of life than this sort of boring tranquility that you're talking about. But there's a kind of keeping in mind this reduction of ambivalence and this kind of singular path. You get this idea too that it maps on, or is exactly like a cognitive, I guess, expression of their physicalist universe, because they have this idea, don't they, that there's a kind of psychophysical substance that constitutes us. So in a sense, we are material substances, but on the other hand, we're also having cognitive experiences. We have judgments, and we have propositional content in the mind, but likewise, simultaneously, they are properties of the body, so they could be physical states as well. And to me, that kind of gives this idea of that if you can minimize the ambivalence, there's a settling down too in the body, a kind of calmness, a kind of tranquility and peaceful state of being. And once you've experienced that deep relaxation, don't you then think, when people are talking about how much they love anxiety, basically, you just think, what are you talking about?
Yeah, no, 100%, Courtney. And that's another, I think, wonderful thing about Stoicism is it doesn't minimize the bodily. In fact, it maximizes it and unites it. It doesn't present it as being in opposition to the cognitive. It presents it as being not exactly, well, yeah, united, I guess, but also working in harmony. And any sort of system, I guess, which doesn't take account of embodiment and doesn't take account of the way we experience emotions as embodied, I think is perhaps missing a really important point that the Stoics completely got.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder how virtue sits into that picture, because obviously we talk about virtue often as idealistic or ideal cognitive content, but from a physicalist description, then being virtuous also refers to having a kind of tension, a kind of tone of body and soul, which is the same thing. So there's a kind of lack of looseness and lack of ambivalence and lack of wishy-washiness. I don't know, in my mind, I get this idea of a fabric that is just loosely spread out with holes in it, you know, but they're not going for that. They're going for a complete density, so that it's like steel. It's completely, you know, can bear it can carry and bear the kind of experience that a human being should be able to bear by its own nature.
Yeah, that's beautifully put, Courtney, and I totally agree. And I think prosoche kind of is part of that, because when we properly pay attention, we are in tension with our environment, in the sense, not in a negative way, but in a positive way, in perceiving the relationships that are in play at the time. That part of prosoche is being aware of where the tensions are and that's another way of saying where the connections are and where the networks are in where we find ourselves at a particular moment.
Yeah, more and more, I think prosoche is absolutely central. And if you were going to do a sort of Stoic therapy, you would have to have prosoche kind of at the center of it. And obviously, because there's a sense in this, again, is my understanding, that although the self may be much larger than and include all sorts of different things as we have in the modern world, you know, like personality and things like that, but in this ancient kind of perspective, it seems like what the exercise of prosoche kind of targets is the command faculty, the hegemonicon. And that's the part they're really saying is up to you. That's the part that if you center or your vigilance and your awareness in, that's the part of the self that actually matters. I mean,
Absolutely, yeah. And that's the part that Zeus has put there for us to make use of. Again, if we are properly exercising our nature and properly using our reason. And again, that's just something that, I mean, you'd be a better place than I am to comment on this, but the reasoning faculty isn't something that tends to get a whole lot of attention these days. People tend to, there seems to be a lot more emphasis, and again, possibly social media has something to do with, a lot more emphasis on reaction rather than assessment and proper use of reason before responding to stimuli. But yes, for the Stoics, the hegemonicon was absolutely key, and we see that in Epictetus, we see it in Marcus, we see it in Seneca, although he's possibly a little more nuanced about it. But yeah, it's absolutely key, and maybe again, this is something that we can help younger people to focus on a bit, is their capacity to make decisions.
Yeah.
They don't have to respond straight away, and they don't have to respond in whatever they think the culture is telling them to do. They can and should develop their own power to decide.
Yeah. And just as simply as having space between your thoughts and your need to act upon them. As you said, the stimulus and response. And I think, like you say, unfortunately, with behaviorism in psychology, that became enormously influential, but it compared animal behavior to human behavior, and through the power of, operant conditioning and stuff like that. So, but more and more psychologists, I think, realize you just can't predict human behavior, because human beings are able to stop prior to reacting to us, prior to an immediate response. They are able to stop and then go, hang on a second, do I really want to behave that way? And that's something that animals don't seem to readily do. But this ties us into, again, something really important, I think, in Stoicism, is that they are very aware of plasticity, or this notion of habit. So, and this is the kind of thing that can make us like animals, because if we behave in certain ways repetitively, and I'm thinking of the Pavlovian experiment where he rings the bell and the dog salivates, that's the kind of thing that happens for human beings too. They form a habit and they form a shape. In that language of the Stoics, their soul takes on a certain shape, and when the impression strikes it, they're moved according to the shape. So if it's a natural shape, they'll move according to their nature, but if it's an unnatural shape against nature, they'll move in very disharmonious kind of ways. But the point there is that human beings still can alter the shape of their soul through their own inner reflection, which animals tend not to be able to do.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Courtney. And I think a lot of we these days, if anything, we're at risk of identifying human behavior too much with its animal forebears, without thinking about the things that actually make humans unique. And one of those is the reflection, the capacity to reflect. Now, the other point to make too is, I think there's some evidence to suggest that the higher mammals in particular also have a certain amount of reflective capacity. So maybe it's quite likely that the Stoics are a bit restrictive in confining that capacity to humans. Certainly there seems to be intentional behavior manifested by the higher animals as well. But I don't think the Stoics would necessarily have a problem with our accepting that, as long as we remember that humans have a far higher degree of reflective capacity than even the higher mammals. And that's something that tends to be forgotten in contexts in which simple ideas about reward and punishment, which a lot of, there do seem to have been an awful lot of educational research, for instance, which seems to focus on just, simple, pretty crude reward systems, without seeing the whole picture of human learning. And that makes me wonder whether we've advanced very much in our assessment of human learning since Plato in the Meno.
Yeah. Which brings us back to virtue, because in the old Socratic tradition, it's our beliefs about what is good, and, the ultimate good, the best forms of the good, which if we really take them on and we really believe that a certain way of being in the world is good, that's all the motivation required to readjust the shape of one's soul, or to make one's shape a particular type. And I guess we could say maybe that's what the Stoics are pointing at, is our very rational ability to conceive of a kind of moral character in a certain kind of way, and to do it actively, which animals probably can't do. They might say, well, I want to get the honey out of the bee's nest, but because that would be good. But the human being is able to do far more abstract things and go, well, I want to be the kind of man who rescues Helen from Menelaus, or whatever, something much more abstract.
Yeah. And also that brings us back to the idea of strengths too, because again, in the Meno, which is what I'm thinking about at the moment, the comparison is made between developing a skill, say playing the guitar, or developing your skill at a sport. That is a kind of a strength, which we know how we can develop it. We develop it by a habit, by practice, and also we know that those skills can be taught, because we get a guitar teacher for our child if they seem to be talented, or a cricket coach. So we know that strengths, that kind of strength, can, to one degree or another, in a receptive person and a person with the basic aptitudes can be taught. So by analogy with that, the moral strengths, the strengths of character, can also be developed, again, by habit, by repetition, by practice, and I would say by example to a certain extent, which is maybe where the coaching aspect comes in. If we see someone who's manifesting good traits, we want to imitate that. And that's, again, something that children can do, and that we know that they imitate, and adults can do as well. So yes, I think the idea of incremental, small, habitual changes in the psyche, if you like, or the soul, are part of this process which we call acquiring virtue.
Yeah, and planting the seed for really virtuous motivation, I guess, somehow. Yeah. And changing topic a little bit, I am very curious about your interest in the Victorian era, and is there something about that where virtue comes into the picture, sort of renewed or reinvigorated or something that struck you as interesting?
Yeah, I think well, certainly the Victorian period was a very interesting period for the reception of ancient ideas. So in a sense, the culture had absorbed the Stoic ideas before it really came to grips with Plato. So for instance, in the very early 19th century, there really wasn't much access to Plato's works in the English-speaking tradition, I should say. It may well have been different in the German tradition, but I'm not really sure about that. So when a guy called Thomas Taylor put out a full translation of Plato's works, and I think it took him a long time. I think it came out in about 1805. And unfortunately, he didn't do a great job. But that was the first time and when you consider that's a very long time after Plato, that's the first time that it was available in an edition where English speakers could read it. And so that but it had a quite important impact on culture throughout the 19th century, this kind of rediscovery of Plato. Plato, of course, had always been there in disguise, I guess, incognito, as some historians have put it. Plato had traveled incognito throughout history, and including through the Christian tradition. So, he found a pretty fertile field in 19th century Anglo culture. But by the end of the century, this more, I suppose, physical or animal ideas coming out of the Darwinian revolution had come to really have an impact on Christian beliefs, and I guess on the fate of virtue thought, which kind of really went into a decline by the end of the century. And as we see in someone like Nietzsche, an actual anti-virtue feeling coming through. And by the time we're reading Freud, it seemed to have lost sight of of any kind of cultural awareness of virtue, where it wasn't simply repression in his view. So I think that period we've been looking at in those readings is kind of key for the gradual loss of a sense of virtue. And of course, the 20th century, when we had 2 world wars, the rise of totalitarian regimes, that was essentially the death knell to virtue thought, I would say. And by the 1960s, when we've got the sex and drugs revolution, that was the final word for virtue. And really, we haven't seen it except in maybe the Stoic revival in the last probably 15 years. So I think we're at a very interesting moment culturally, where people are looking for some kind of moral framework, I think. And that's, I think, where the Stoic revival's coming in.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting point, because I've often wondered that, like, why now? Why Stoicism? What's interesting about it for people? Why is it growing so quickly? But I think what you said there is a really important point too, because like you said, the wars and people like Nietzsche and Freud, and obviously for them with their idea of natural selection, something to do with power or pleasure wins out over more idealistic notions like virtue, which is interesting though, because you would think if they took the Stoic argument sort of, or the theory seriously, and they could have had a physicalist or materialist description of the, you know, the value or the necessity of virtue as a kind of cognitive component of what a good organic life looks like, for example. But no, they went in the direction of something like psychic processes and these kind of inner drives of the individual which shape destiny and can, and like you say, with the war there were very charismatic individuals that, you know, altered the face of the world in some respects, in Hitler and Stalin and Lenin and so on, Mao. But yeah, just on that point about what's going on now, like, do you, yeah, maybe you're right, maybe to circle right back where we started from, you know, with the help of psychology and interested academics, maybe virtue can have an uprising.
Yeah, well, look, it would be good. I mean, unfortunately, you made the point earlier about reading the Code of Ethics, and codes of ethics are great, but do they have any kind of compelling impact where people haven't already made a personal commitment? So, I mean, I'm just thinking, unfortunately, I'm sure there are plenty of codes of ethics in our political systems, but you just have to look at our political actors to realize that a code of ethics is one thing, actually acting with integrity is quite another. So, and of course, as we've mentioned before, you know, politics is maybe a bit of a lowest common denominator. Unfortunately, that puts role models in the public eye that are not great. And in fact, you know, sport as well puts role models out there that leave something to be desired. So
that's what's so wonderful about Stoicism, is its practical nature, its interest in taking a philosophy and translating it into a kind of art or practice of life. And what I found is when that's taken on, the average Joe like me can become a participant and can share and talk about these sorts of things. So it takes it out of the hands of the politician and the strictly academic and the sports hero, and it makes it available to public discourse. And that's one thing I've found in the book reading, for example, is that there's a need out there that people have to not be sidelined, to know that, well, there's enough information out there, and yes, I'm not a genius, but this stuff is practical in nature, and it's the kind of thing that any rational human being can grasp and use to improve their life. And even at some point, perhaps, and here I'm going to get into trouble, innovate around and find ways to more effectively adopt it in a modern world, for example.
Yeah, completely agree, Courtney. Yeah, that's one of the great things. I mean, even you know, reading Plato isn't that hard to read. You know, it would be great if people took a bit more, you know, interest in some of these texts that are essentially very practical. I think the philosophy as a way of life movement and the Stoic, I guess, branch is the most prominent aspect of that, but it has brought these philosophical ideas out of the academy and into life. And I think that's where the modern Stoic movement is great. And we've got, you know, where our Stoicons, where people come along and they realize there are practical things they can take away. There are practices that they can use in their daily life, which will help to make their life better, because ultimately that's what virtue is. Virtue was the original self-help, as well as the original pro-social program.
Yeah, absolutely. What a great place to kind of wind up. I just want to thank you for being one of those, well, what's the word? Inclusive and open individuals who have access to academia, but also are very open to other people to come and join and to learn and to share, and just the way in which you kind of make a person feel welcome is really, it's a wonderful thing. So thanks, Judith.
Oh, thank you, Courtney. It's been a great pleasure as always.
Yeah, and I look forward to more conversations going forward. This is great. And we just got to try and encourage more people not to be afraid of the material. And I mean, I say to everyone, if I can do it, anyone can do it. I'm a tradesman, so there you go. You know. Thanks a lot, Judith. Enjoy your day, and I'll see you soon.
Thanks, Courtney. Bye.
Thanks.